Welcome back to the show, everyone, and today we are diving into a story that is so layered and so deeply tragic that it almost feels like a movie script, but every single detail is chillingly real. We are talking about the man who transformed a racial slur into a crown of blood and a public humiliation into a throne of absolute power. This is the story of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man who taught the most powerful mobs in New York that respect is a matter of life or death. Imagine a 1935 Harlem where a single white gangster named Dutch Schultz thought he could own every street and every soul through fear and white privilege. But he made the fatal mistake of disrespecting the one man who had been forged in the fire of the Jim Crow South and sharpened in the dungeons of prison. What followed was a surgical 7-day war where 8 men were executed one by one with a chilling countdown that left the city in total shock. Before we peel back the layers of this cold-blooded strategy, I have to ask you guys something very personal. Do you think respect is something that should be given automatically, or is it something that must be taken by force when the world refuses to acknowledge your dignity? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are ready to see how one man redefined the rules of the underworld for 100 years, please hit that like button and subscribe to our community. On October 31, 1905, while the world was celebrating Halloween, a baby boy named Ellsworth Johnson was born into a family that was already struggling to keep their heads above water in a world that did not want them to succeed. His parents were hard-working people who just wanted a peaceful life, but Charleston at that time was not a place for peace. If you were a black family trying to make a name for yourself or even just survive another day, Ellsworth was born with a small physical deformity on the back of his head, which led to the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life and eventually strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. Bumpy. Can you imagine being a young child and having your identity tied to something you could not control? That little bump was the first of many things that marked him as different, and it gave him a thick skin before he even knew what a street fight was in his neighborhood. Growing up in the Jim Crow South meant that your life could be decided by the whim of a stranger who did not like the way you walked or the way you looked them in the eye. For young Ellsworth, the world was divided into two very distinct and dangerous parts. There was the warmth of his home and the cold, unforgiving reality of the streets where a wrong turn or a misunderstood word could lead to a tragedy that no mother should ever have to witness in her entire lifetime. His family was so poor that they often had nothing to eat for days, and young Ellsworth had to watch his parents skip meals just so the children could have a few crumbs. This kind of hunger does something to a person. It creates a hollow feeling in your stomach that never truly goes away, even when you are eating the most expensive steaks in New York City 20 years later. It forged a hunger for power and security that would define his every move. His older brother Willie was his hero and the person he looked up to more than anyone else in the world. Willie was strong and charismatic, and he seemed to navigate the dangers of Charleston with a grace that Ellsworth admired. But in a world built on inequality, even the strongest and smartest can be brought down by a lie. One afternoon in 1919, the fragile peace of the Johnson household was shattered forever by a single false accusation. A white man had been found dead, and in the heat of a town looking for someone to blame, the finger was pointed directly at Willie Johnson. It did not matter that there was no evidence or that Willie was miles away when it happened. In 1919 South Carolina, the truth was often the first victim of a mob. The news spread through the town like a wildfire, and the Johnson family knew that the sun would not set before the angry mob came looking for blood. Ellsworth watched as his mother sold every piece of jewelry she owned, and his father reached out to every contact he had to raise enough money to save his son. They knew they could not win a physical fight against an entire town, so they chose the only option they had left, which was flight. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Willie was hidden in a crate and smuggled out of Charleston, heading north toward a place they hoped would be kinder and safer. The departure of his brother left a massive hole in Ellsworth that could never be filled, and it planted a seed of resentment that would grow into a forest of rebellion. He saw his parents broken and humiliated by a system that treated them as less than human, and he made a silent vow that he would never let anyone do that to him. He would not be a victim, and he would not run away unless he was the one holding all the cards at the very end of the deal. Shortly after Willie left, the family realized that Ellsworth was also in danger because his temper was starting to flare, and he was no longer willing to bow his head to the people who oppressed them. His mother saw the fire in his eyes, and she knew that if he stayed in Charleston, he would either end up in a grave or behind bars. So she packed his small suitcase with his few belongings and a little bit of food for the long and lonely journey ahead of him. At just 14 years old, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was put on a train heading toward New York City. He watched the familiar trees of the South disappear through the window, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. He was heading toward a place called Harlem, which was being described as a promised land for people like him, but he knew deep down that every city has its own shadows, and he was already very familiar with how to hide in them. When the train pulled into Pennsylvania Station, the sheer scale of New York was enough to overwhelm anyone. The noise of the cars and the hundreds of people rushing in every direction was a world away from the dusty roads of Charleston. Ellsworth stood on the platform, clutching his suitcase, feeling the cold northern air bite at his skin. He did not have much, but he had a brain that worked faster than most and a heart that had already started turning to stone. He made his way to his sister Mabel's apartment in Harlem, and as he walked through the streets, he saw something he had never seen before. He saw black men and women walking with their heads held high and shops owned by people who looked like him. There was an energy in the air that felt like possibility, but beneath that energy, he could smell the same old familiar scent of crime and desperation. Harlem was a beautiful dream, but it had a very dark underbelly. His sister Mabel tried her best to give him a stable home, but Ellsworth was not interested in a quiet life or a low-paying job. He spent his days exploring the corners of Harlem, watching the way the street gamblers moved and the way the local tough guys collected their money. He was a student of human nature, and he realized very quickly that in New York, money was the only thing that could actually buy you a seat at the table and the respect you deserved. The kids in Harlem were not kind to the new boy with the southern accent and the bump on his head. They teased him and tried to bully him, but they did not realize that they were picking a fight with someone who had been forged in the fires of the Jim Crow South. Ellsworth did not back down, and he did not cry. He fought back with a ferocity that stunned the older boys, and soon the name Bumpy was no longer a joke, but a warning to stay away from him. One of his first mentors in the streets was a man named Bub Hewlett, who saw the potential in the young boy and decided to take him under his wing. Bub taught him the basics of the protection racket and how to spot a mark from a mile away. He taught him that in the world of crime, your reputation is your most valuable currency, and if you let someone slide once, they will walk all over you for the rest of your life and take everything you have worked for. Ellsworth began to realize that he had a natural talent for numbers and strategy. He could look at a situation and see 10 moves ahead, while everyone else was still trying to figure out the first one. This intelligence set him apart from the average street thug who only knew how to use their fists. Bumpy was different because he used his mind as a weapon, and he was starting to build a small crew of his own who were fiercely loyal to him and his vision. But the law caught up with him faster than he expected. Between 1920 and 1932, Ellsworth spent more time in prison than out of it. He was arrested for everything from burglary to grand larceny, and he was sent to some of the toughest correctional facilities in the state. Many people would have been broken by the system, but Bumpy used his time behind bars to educate himself in ways that a regular school could never provide to him. He spent hours in the prison library reading books on philosophy and history and law. He began to write poetry as a way to process the anger and the beauty he saw in the world around him. He realized that the white men who ran the world were not smarter than him, but they had a better understanding of how the system worked. He decided that when he got out, he would not just be a gangster, but he would be a businessman who operated in the cold shadows. While he was in prison, the world outside was changing rapidly. The Prohibition era had turned New York into a battlefield for bootleggers, and the rise of organized crime was creating new opportunities for those brave enough to take them. Harlem was becoming a major hub for the policy game, which was a form of illegal lottery that everyone from the janitor to the preacher played every single day. It was a gold mine that was waiting for a leader to take control. When Bumpy was finally released in 1932, he walked out of the prison gates as a completely different man. He was no longer the impulsive kid from Charleston who fought with his fists. He was a cold and calculating strategist who had a plan to take over the very streets that had once tried to swallow him whole. He looked at the skyline of New York, and he knew that his time had finally come to show the world who Ellsworth Johnson really was. He returned to Harlem and found that the landscape had been taken over by a powerful woman named Madame Stephanie St. Clair. She was the queen of the policy banks, and she was one of the few people who dared to stand up to the white mobsters who wanted to take over her business. Bumpy saw in her a kindred spirit and a mentor who could help him reach the level of power he had always dreamed of achieving since he was a small boy in South Carolina. Madame St. Clair was impressed by Bumpy's intelligence and his unwavering loyalty. She hired him as her chief enforcer and gave him the task of protecting her runners and her banks from the encroaching threat of the Italian and Jewish mobs. This was the moment when Bumpy Johnson truly stepped onto the stage of history and began the journey that would lead him to the legendary confrontation at the Cotton Club and the bloody war that followed afterward. The air in Harlem was thick with tension as the year 1933 approached. The Great Depression had left people desperate, and the policy game was often the only way a family could afford to pay their rent or buy food. Madame St. Clair was a hero to the community because she gave back to the people, but she was also a target for men like Dutch Schultz, who saw her success as an insult to his own power and his massive ego in the underworld. Bumpy stood by her side as the first shots were fired in a war that would last for years. He watched as Schultz used violence and bribery to slowly chip away at the independent policy banks, and he knew that a direct confrontation was inevitable. He began to recruit his own army of loyal men who were tired of being treated like second-class citizens in their own neighborhood. They were ready to fight for their home and their dignity against any outsider. As we end this first part of our journey, we see Bumpy Johnson standing on the threshold of greatness and destruction. He has survived the trauma of his childhood and the harshness of prison, and he is now the protector of the Queen of Harlem. But the shadow of Dutch Schultz is looming large, and the events that are about to unfold will test every bit of his strength and his cunning. The real battle for Harlem is about to begin right now. So, we left off with Ellsworth arriving in New York City in 1919, and honestly, guys, you have to imagine the culture shock of this 14-year-old boy. He is coming from the dusty, quiet roads of South Carolina, where you had to lower your eyes to every white person you passed on the sidewalk, and suddenly he is in Harlem. It was loud, and it was vibrant, and it felt like every single person was in a hurry to get somewhere important. He moved into his sister Mabel's tiny apartment on 139th Street, and for a while he tried to be the good kid she wanted him to be. But Harlem in the early 20s was not just a neighborhood, it was a living, breathing beast that demanded you choose a side. You were either a worker or you were a hustler, and Ellsworth was watching the hustlers with a very keen interest. He noticed they were the ones who truly owned the streets. But before he could become a king, he had to survive being a target. The local boys in Harlem were incredibly tough, and they did not take kindly to this new kid with the thick southern drawl and that very noticeable physical trait on the back of his head. The nickname Bumpy started as a weapon used by bullies to make him feel small and ugly and different. They would follow him home from school, shouting the name and trying to trip him up in the snow. Can you imagine the loneliness of that moment? You have already lost your brother to a lynch mob, and now you are in a new city where even your own people are picking you apart. But Ellsworth did not crumble under the pressure. Instead, he used that name as a catalyst for a transformation. One afternoon, a group of older boys cornered him in an alleyway, thinking he would be an easy mark, but they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Ellsworth did not just fight back, he exploded with a level of violence that seemed almost supernatural for a boy of his age. He did not care about the size of his opponents or how many of them there were. He fought with a desperate need to prove that he was no longer a victim. By the time the fight was over, the bullies were scattered and bleeding, and the name Bumpy was no longer a taunt. It had become a brand of respect that he earned in blood. As he reached his late teens, Ellsworth started spending less time at home and more time in the dark corners of Harlem's pool halls and speakeasies. This was where the real education began for him. He met a man named Bub Hewlett, who was the premier black gangster of the time, and Hewlett saw something in Bumpy that no one else did. He saw a strategic mind that could calculate odds faster than a professional gambler and a heart that was completely cold. Bub Hewlett was known as the King of the Goons, and he took Bumpy under his wing to teach him the machinery of the protection racket. He taught him that in Harlem, power did not come from the police or the government, but from the fear and respect you could inspire in your neighbors. Bumpy learned how to walk into a shop and demand a weekly fee in exchange for protection from the very violence he was capable of delivering himself if they refused. He also began to understand the racial dynamics of the New York underworld. He saw that while black gangsters controlled the streets of Harlem, the real money was being funneled to the white mobs in the Bronx and Brooklyn. This realization made him furious. He did not understand why his people were doing all the heavy lifting and taking all the risks, while the Italian and Jewish mobs were sitting back and collecting the lion's share of the profits. By 1923, Bumpy was already making a name for himself as a man who could get things done quietly and efficiently. He was not like the other street thugs who bragged about their crimes in the bars. Bumpy was a ghost who moved in the shadows and spoke very few words. He was always watching and always learning, and he was starting to realize that the illegal lottery, known as the policy game, was the key to true independence. The policy game was everywhere in Harlem, and it was the heartbeat of the community. Everyone played their favorite three numbers every single day, hoping for a win that could pay their rent or buy a new pair of shoes. Bumpy saw that the men who ran these policy banks were like kings, but they were also vulnerable. They needed protection from the police and from other gangs, and Bumpy was more than happy to provide that service for a very high price. In 1924, he had his first major brush with the law that actually stuck. He was arrested for grand larceny and sent to prison, but instead of being a setback, it was more like a graduate school for a criminal mind. In the cell blocks, he met men from all over the country, and he learned the different ways that organized crime was evolving. He realized that the future was not in small-time robberies, but in controlling the flow of money in an entire city. While he was locked away, a newspaper article was published in 1925 that would change his life forever. The article vatztrun the inner workings of the Harlem underworld and specifically mentioned Bumpy Johnson as the most famous and dangerous black gangster in New York City. It was meant to be an expose to bring him down, but for Bumpy it was the best advertisement he could have ever asked for in his entire life. Suddenly, every criminal in the city knew his name. He was no longer just a local enforcer, he was a legend in the making. The article described his rise from the South and his cold demeanor and his absolute control over his crew. When he finally walked out of those prison gates, he found that the streets were waiting for him with open arms and a new level of fear. He had officially arrived as a major player in the New York City criminal landscape. But with fame came a whole new set of enemies. The white mobs who had previously ignored the black gangsters in Harlem were now starting to take notice of this man named Bumpy. They saw him as a threat to their bottom line and a challenge to their perceived racial superiority. They began to send their own enforcers into Harlem to test his strength and see if he was as tough as the newspapers claimed he was in those sensationalist headlines. Bumpy responded to these incursions with a level of precision that terrified the outsiders. He did not engage in long, drawn-out gunfights in the streets. Instead, he would wait for his enemies to be at their most vulnerable, and then he would strike like a viper. One by one, the enforcers from the Bronx disappeared or were found dead in the gutters of Harlem, and the message was becoming very clear to everyone. Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson. His sister Mabel watched all of this with a breaking heart. She remembered the little boy from Charleston who used to hide behind her skirts, and she could not reconcile that image with the cold man who now carried a .45 automatic in his waistband. She tried to plead with him to go straight, but Bumpy would just look at her with those empty eyes and tell her that the world did not have a place for a straight black man who wanted to be successful. By 1925, the stage was set for the next chapter of his life. He had the reputation, and he had the crew, and he had the backing of the most powerful people in Harlem. But he was still missing one thing, which was a mentor who could show him how to turn his street power into a true empire. He was about to meet a woman who would change everything for him and lead him into the most dangerous and profitable era of his entire career. This was the era of the policy queens and the rise of the independent black banks. Bumpy was ready to stop being a soldier and start being a general. He was done taking orders from men like Bub Hewlett, and he was ready to start giving them. The air in Harlem was electric with the promise of change, and Bumpy Johnson was standing at the very center of it all, with a cigarette in his mouth and a plan that would reshape the city for the next century. He started to consolidate his power by bringing the smaller gangs under his control. He offered them a simple choice, which was to work for him and get a piece of the action, or to get out of Harlem forever. Most of them were smart enough to take the deal. He was building an army that was loyal not just to him, but to the idea that Harlem should be run by its own people. This was the beginning of his role as the gatekeeper of the community. As we wrap up this second part of our story, we see a man who has completely shed his past as a victim. Ellsworth Johnson is dead, and Bumpy Johnson has taken his place. He has survived the streets and the prisons and the newspapers, and he is now the most feared man in the 5 boroughs. But the real test is still coming, because the giants of organized crime are starting to look at Harlem as their next big prize, and they have no idea what is coming. The transition from a street enforcer to a strategic leader was almost complete. Bumpy was spending more time reading and studying the way the Italian families in the Lower East Side were organized. He saw their structure and their discipline, and he wanted to replicate it in Harlem. He knew that the only way to beat the white mobs was to be more organized and more disciplined than they were. He was preparing for a war he knew was coming soon. He also started to invest in the community in small ways that would pay off in huge dividends of loyalty later on. He would pay the funeral expenses for a family that had lost a loved one, or buy groceries for a neighbor who was struggling. He was becoming more than just a gangster. He was becoming a pillar of the community who the people could turn to when the official systems failed them. This was the secret to his longevity in the streets. But the darkness was always there, and the violence was never far away. Bumpy was a man who lived by a very strict code of honor, and if you broke that code, the consequences were absolute. He did not believe in second chances when it came to loyalty, and he made sure that everyone in his circle knew exactly what would happen if they ever thought about betraying him to the police or to a rival gang in the city of New York. As the year 1925 came to a close, Bumpy was standing on top of the world. He had fame, and he had money, and he had the respect of everyone he encountered. But he was also a lonely man who could never truly trust anyone. He was always looking over his shoulder and always waiting for the next challenge to his throne. He knew that in the world he lived in, you were only as good as your last victory on the streets. The next few years would be a whirlwind of blood and money and power. Bumpy was about to enter into a partnership that would define the rest of his life and lead him into a direct conflict with the most dangerous men in America. The war for Harlem was no longer just a street fight. It was a battle for the soul of the neighborhood, and Bumpy Johnson was the only one who could lead his people to a victory that would last. So guys, we have to talk about 1925, because for Bumpy Johnson, this was supposed to be the year he conquered Harlem, but instead, it was the year the Iron Gate slammed shut. Imagine being at the height of your street fame and suddenly you are traded for a tiny concrete box where the sun only hits the wall for 20 minutes a day. Between 1920 and 1932, Ellsworth spent more time behind bars than he did on the sidewalks of New York City. The prison system back then was not about rehabilitation, it was about breaking the human spirit until there was nothing left but dust. He was moved through facilities like Sing Sing and Auburn, where the air was thick with the smell of floor wax and unwashed bodies. For most men, this would be the end of the road, but for Bumpy, this was actually his cocoon. He decided right then that if the state was going to take his time, he was going to take their knowledge and use it as a weapon. While the other inmates were playing cards or fighting over extra rations, Bumpy was heading to the prison library every single morning. He became a ghost in the stacks of dusty books. He started reading everything he could get his hands on, from ancient philosophy to modern law and complex history. He was obsessed with understanding why certain men succeeded while others failed. He realized that the white men who oppressed him were not smarter, they just had a better playbook. Can you imagine him sitting there in a gray uniform reading Machiavelli and Shakespeare while the guards yelled in the background? He was building an intellectual armor that no bullet could ever pierce. He read about the great generals of history and the ways they managed their troops and their resources. He was no longer just a guy from Charleston who could fight. He was becoming a strategist who understood that the real power in New York was not in the fist, but in the brain. This was also the period where he discovered the power of the written word, and he began to write poetry to process the absolute chaos around him. His cell was covered in scraps of paper filled with verses about the beauty of Harlem and the coldness of the bars. This poetry was his only escape, and it allowed him to keep his humanity in a place designed to strip it away. He was developing a reputation as the poet of Harlem even before he was back on the streets. He spent hours studying the law because he wanted to know exactly how the system that kept him locked up actually functioned. He wanted to find the loopholes and the cracks where a man like him could slip through. He realized that the criminal justice system was just another business, and if you knew the rules, you could manipulate the outcome. This was a radical shift in his thinking. He was moving away from being a criminal and moving toward being a cold businessman. His interactions with other prisoners were also a major part of his evolution. He was meeting guys from the major mobs in Chicago and Philadelphia, and they were talking about how the national crime landscape was changing. He was learning about the commission and the way the different families were starting to work together to maximize their profits. He was realizing that Harlem was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, and he needed to think much bigger than he ever had before. The guards and the warden started to notice him because he was not like the other inmates. He was quiet and he was disciplined, and he never caused trouble unless someone tried to disrespect him. When Bumpy spoke, even the toughest guys in the yard listened because his words carried the weight of someone who had thought through every single syllable. He was already a leader, even without a crew or a bank account. He was commanding respect through the sheer force of his presence. But the isolation of prison life was also taking a psychological toll on him that he buried deep inside. He missed the sounds of the jazz clubs and the way the lights reflected off the wet pavement in Harlem. He missed his sister Mabel, and he felt a deep guilt for the worry he was causing her every single day. He used this pain as fuel for his ambition. He told himself that when he finally got out, he would never come back to this place again. He would be too smart to get caught. He watched as the years ticked by, and the Prohibition era reached its fever pitch outside those walls. He heard stories of the bloodbath in the streets as Dutch Schultz and the other mobs fought for control of the liquor trade. He knew that the world he was going to return to was much more dangerous than the one he had left. He was preparing himself for a war that he knew was coming, and he was using his time in the dungeon to sharpen his mind like a straight razor. By 1930, he had developed a demeanor that was so cold it was described as frightening by the prison staff. He had learned how to mask his emotions completely so that no one could tell what he was thinking or feeling. This stoicism would become his trademark in the underworld. He realized that in a world of hotheads and impulsive shooters, The man who could stay calm under pressure was the one who would ultimately survive the longest. He also used his time to refine his physical strength. He would do hundreds of push-ups in his cell and practice his footwork until his legs burned. He knew that even though he was a strategist, he still needed to be able to defend himself in a heartbeat. He was becoming a perfect machine of crime and intellect. He was ready to take his place at the table, and he was done being a soldier. He was ready to be the king that Harlem desperately needed in its darkest hour. The final 2 years of his sentence from 1930 to 1932 were the hardest. He could feel the freedom just out of reach, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. He spent his time finalizing his plans and visualizing exactly how he would take over the policy banks once he was back. He knew that Madame Stephanie St. Clair was struggling against the white mobs, and he felt a deep sense of loyalty to her. He wanted to be the shield that protected her empire. When the day finally arrived in 1932 that he was to be released, he walked out of the prison gates with a small bag of his belongings and a notebook full of poetry and plans. He did not look back at the walls that had held him for so long. He was 37 years old, and he had spent almost a third of his life behind bars. But he did not feel like he had lost that time. He felt like he had been forged in a fire that would make him invincible. He took the train back to Harlem, and as he stepped onto the platform, he felt a wave of familiarity wash over him. The air smelled of exhaust and street food and possibility. He looked at the faces of the people passing by, and he saw the same old struggles, but he also saw a new kind of defiance. He was home, and he was ready. He made his way to his sister's house first to let her know he was safe, and then he headed straight for the heart of the neighborhood. The Harlem he returned to was in the middle of a brutal transformation. The Great Depression was crushing the spirits of the community, and the streets were filled with desperate people. But in the shadows, the policy game was booming like never before. It was the only hope for many, and the competition to control it was becoming a bloodbath. Bumpy walked through the streets, and he could feel the eyes on him. People remembered the name, and they were wondering what he would do next. He went to see Madame St. Clair, and the reunion was like something out of a classic movie. She saw in him the man she had always hoped he would become. He was no longer just her enforcer, he was her partner. He told her about what he had learned in prison and how they were going to change the way they did business. He told her that they were not just going to fight for Harlem, they were going to own it. The partnership was sealed with a look of mutual respect. Bumpy started by reorganizing her security and her runners. He implemented a new system of discipline that he had adapted from his studies of military history. He made sure that every person in the organization knew their role and the consequences of failure. He was creating an army that was loyal to the Queen but answered only to him. He was becoming the shadow ruler of the neighborhood, and his influence was growing with every single day that passed. The white mobs in the Bronx heard that Bumpy Johnson was back, and they were initially dismissive. They thought he was just another black gangster who had done some time and was trying to reclaim his old glory. They did not realize that the man who had walked out of prison in 1932 was a genius-level strategist who was 10 steps ahead of them. They were about to learn that Harlem was no longer an open territory for them to exploit. Bumpy began to move against the small-time independent operators who were causing chaos in the streets. He offered them a simple choice, which was to join his organization or face the consequences. Most of them saw the writing on the wall and chose to work for the man who was clearly the new power in town. He was consolidating the fragmented streets into a unified force that could actually stand up to the massive resources of the Italian and Jewish mobs. He was also re-establishing his connection with the community. He started appearing at local events and helping out families who were in trouble. He wanted the people of Harlem to see him as their protector and not just another criminal. He was building a base of support that would make it impossible for the police or the mobs to move against him without facing a backlash from the entire neighborhood. He was playing the long game, and he was winning. As we end this third part of our story, we see a man who has successfully navigated the belly of the beast and emerged stronger than ever before. Bumpy Johnson is no longer the kid with the bump on his head or the impulsive shooter from his teens. He is a poet and a philosopher and a cold-blooded strategist who is ready to go to war. The shadow of Dutch Schultz is still there, but Bumpy is no longer afraid of the dark because he has become the master of it. The streets of Harlem were quiet for a moment, but it was the quiet before a massive storm. Bumpy was sitting in a dimly lit office, planning his next move, and he knew that the confrontation with Schultz was coming soon. He was ready to put everything he had learned in prison to the test. He was ready to show the world that a man from Charleston could take on the most powerful mobster in New York and come out on top. The stage was finally set. So guys, we have to talk about 1932 because this is the year the legend truly begins to take shape in the streets of Harlem, and honestly it is so chilling to imagine the scene when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked out of those prison gates. He was no longer that impulsive teenager from Charleston, but a man who had spent his time in the dungeon sharpening his mind like a weapon. He stepped back into a Harlem that was pulsating with a very desperate kind of energy. The Great Depression was hitting the neighborhood so hard, and people were literally starving on the streets, but in the shadows there was a massive gold mine that kept the community breathing. It was called the policy game, and guys, you have to understand that this was not just gambling to the people of Harlem. It was their bank and their only hope for a better tomorrow. It functioned entirely on a deep level of community trust that outsiders could never understand. At the top of this empire was a woman named Madame Stephanie Street Clare, whom everyone called the Queen of Harlem, or simply Madame Queen. She was an immigrant from the West Indies, and she was absolutely fierce and sophisticated, and she did not take any garbage from anyone. She had built a massive network of policy banks that provided jobs for thousands of people in the neighborhood. But as Bumpy returned, he found that his mentor was under a massive and brutal siege. A white mobster from the Bronx named Dutch Schultz had set his sights on Harlem, and honestly, his greed was just bottomless. Schultz was not just trying to make money, he wanted to own everything and everyone in his path. He had spent the last 18 months launching a campaign of terror to drive the independent black operators out of business. He viewed the black gangsters as inferior and thought taking over would be simple with enough guns. Schultz had already successfully driven Madame Street Clare toward a forced retirement, and he had managed to push Casper Holstein, who was another major operator, out of the business entirely. He was using a combination of brutal violence and political bribes to crush any local resistance. Schultz believed that since he was white and had more money, he could just stomp his way into Harlem and treat the local people with total contempt. When Bumpy walked into Madame Street Clare's office, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the heavy weight of looming defeat. She saw Bumpy and she knew that her luck had finally changed. He was the enforcer she needed because he did not just bring muscle, he brought a strategic mind that could counter Schultz's brute force. Bumpy looked at the maps of the territory and he saw exactly what Schultz was doing wrong in his campaign. Schultz's biggest mistake, guys, was that he was an outsider who brought white collectors into Harlem who treated the local residents like they were nothing. These men came into the neighborhood to extract money, but they had absolutely no stake in the community, and they were creating a massive wave of resentment. Bumpy realized that while Schultz had the money and the police on his side, he would never have the hearts and minds of Harlem. Bumpy officially became the chief enforcer for Madame Queen, and his first task was to organize a defense that was both visible and psychological. He knew that Schultz's runners were being beaten and intimidated every day to force them to work for the Bronx mob. Bumpy began to recruit his own team of loyal associates who had proven their capability and their absolute silence, even under the threat of torture from the rival gangs. He told these men that they were not just fighting for a policy bank, but they were fighting for the dignity of their neighborhood. Bumpy started shadowing the collectors and the enforcers that Schultz had sent into Harlem. He was like a ghost in the shadows, watching their every move and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He wanted Schultz to feel the constant pressure of being watched by an enemy that he could not see or understand until it was too late. The violence began to escalate quickly as 1933 rolled in and the streets of Harlem became a war zone. Schultz was sending his men to burn down policy banks and beat up anyone who refused to pay him a percentage of their earnings. But Bumpy was hitting back even harder. He was sabotaging Schultz's liquor deliveries and disrupting his operations in ways that cost the mobster thousands of dollars every single week in lost profits. Schultz was becoming increasingly frustrated because he could not find Bumpy Johnson. He offered substantial amounts of money for any information about Bumpy's location, but the people of Harlem refused to talk. They saw Bumpy as their protector, and they were furious about the way Schultz's men were treating them on the streets. The community began to actively protect Bumpy by providing him with safe houses and warning him. Imagine the psychological toll on Schultz, who was used to getting exactly what he wanted through fear and privilege. He was being outmaneuvered by a man he considered to be an inferior operator, and it was driving him absolutely insane. Bumpy was using everything he learned in prison about military strategy and psychological warfare to keep Schultz off balance. He knew that a direct frontal assault would be suicide, so he was chipping away at the foundation. Bumpy was also refining his image in the community during this time. He would walk through the streets in his perfectly tailored suits, greeting everyone by name and stopping to help those in need. He was building a legend as the gentleman gangster who was the only one brave enough to stand up to the white mob. This was a very deliberate move to ensure that when the final war came, he would have the total support of the residents of Harlem. Madame Street Claire watched as Bumpy took control of the situation, and she began to trust his judgment more than her own. He was no longer just the muscle, he was the architect of their survival. They were operating in a world where the police were on Schultz's payroll, so Bumpy had to create his own system of justice. He made it clear that any betrayal within their own organization would be met with the most severe and permanent consequences imaginable. The tension between the Harlem operators and the Schultz organization was reaching a boiling point that everyone knew would eventually lead to a massive explosion. Schultz was becoming more reckless with his threats and his public displays of contempt for the black gangsters. He was making the conflict personal, which was exactly what Bumpy wanted him to do. Bumpy knew that an emotional enemy is an enemy that makes fatal strategic mistakes. During this period, Bumpy was also secretly meeting with other major players in the New York underworld to gauge their reactions to the conflict. He wanted to make sure that the Italian families would not interfere if he decided to take the fight directly to Schultz. He was playing a very high-stakes game of diplomacy in the shadows, ensuring that he would not be fighting the entire city at once, but only the man who had disrespected his home. He was spending his nights in the back rooms of speakeasies, planning out the order of his strikes and identifying the key operators in Schultz's organization. He knew every name and every face and every habit of the men who worked for the Dutchman. He was building a list that would eventually become the foundation for the 7-Day War that would change everything. He was waiting for the one moment where Schultz would cross the final line of no return. Guys, you have to understand that Bumpy was not just a criminal, he was a philosopher of power. He believed that respect was the only currency that truly mattered in the world he lived in. He saw Schultz's lack of respect as a strategic vulnerability that he could exploit to destroy the man's entire empire. Every slur and every insult that Schultz threw at Harlem was another nail in the coffin of his own organization, and Bumpy was the one hammer. As 1933 came to a close, the lines were drawn, and the soldiers were in place. Bumpy Johnson was no longer the assistant, he was the leader of the Harlem resistance. He had the loyalty of his men and the protection of his community, and the cold, brilliant mind of a chess master. The shadow of Dutch Schultz was still large, but Bumpy was standing right in the center of it with a .45 automatic and a plan that was about to unfold. The air in Harlem was cold, but the streets were burning with a quiet intensity. People were whispering Bumpy's 10 in the clubs and on the corners as the man who was going to take back their neighborhood. The policy game was still functioning, but every runner knew they were part of a war now. The transition was complete, and Bumpy Johnson was ready to show the world that Harlem belonged to Harlem, and he was the one who held the keys to the gate. This was the calm before the most violent week in the history of New York's underworld. Bumpy was sitting in his apartment on West 139th Street, looking at the list of 8 names he had carefully selected. These were the men who made Schultz's operation function, and their deaths would be the message that the world would never forget. He was ready to pronounce the sentence that he had been preparing for years. The psychological preparation was just as important as the physical weapons. Bumpy wanted his men to understand that they were not just killers, but they were instruments of justice for a community that had been disrespected for too long. He was imbuing his cause with a moral authority that would make his assassins fearless and his enemies terrified. The stage was set for the legendary confrontation that would begin at the Cotton Club. As we end this part of the journey, we see Bumpy Johnson standing at the peak of his strategic preparation. He has the Queen behind him and an army of loyal brothers in front of him. He is waiting for the spark that will ignite the fire. Dutch Schultz has no idea that the man he considers to be a nobody is actually the one who will bring his entire world crashing down in just 7 days of absolute and methodical carnage in the streets of New York. The year 1933 was when the shadow of the man they called the Dutchman truly began to suffocate the streets of Harlem, and honestly, it is so heartbreaking to think about the families who were just trying to survive the Depression while this monster was knocking on their doors. Dutch Schultz was not a man who understood the concept of enough because he was driven by a hunger for power that was almost pathological in its intensity for control. Schultz was sitting on a criminal empire that was generating an estimated $20 million annually, which is a mind-blowing amount of money for that time. He had the Bronx, and he had the beer business, and he had the police in his pocket, but he looked at Harlem and saw a gold mine that was being run by people he considered to be inferior to his own organization. He did not see businessmen, he saw a race he could easily bully. He began a campaign of systematic destruction that was so brutal and so loud that it felt like an invading army had moved into northern Manhattan. Schultz believed that violence alone would be sufficient to control Harlem because he assumed that money and white privilege gave him the right to treat everyone else like garbage. He was moving into the territory with a level of arrogance that blinded him to the actual reality of the community. Bumpy Johnson was standing in the middle of this storm, and he was watching everything with a quiet intensity that was actually much more frightening than the Dutchman's loud rage. While Schultz was screaming and shooting, Bumpy was taking mental notes. He was watching Schultz drive Madame St. Clair into retirement and force Casper Holstein out of the business by using a combination of bribes and threats and raw firepower. Can you imagine the pressure of being the last line of defense for an entire neighborhood against a man who had $20 million and the law on his side? Bumpy saw that Schultz was making fundamental strategic errors that revealed his total misunderstanding of how power actually worked in Harlem. Schultz thought he was winning because he was killing people, but Bumpy knew that he was actually losing because he was creating enemies. Schultz's biggest mistake was assuming that he could control territory through fear alone without ever having the support of the people who lived there. He brought in white collectors and enforcers who treated the local residents with a level of contempt that was truly disgusting. These outsiders came into Harlem only to extract money, and they showed absolutely no respect for the community that had built the policy operations. These collectors would walk into local shops and demand a cut of the profits while using racial slurs and treating the owners like they were lucky to even be breathing the same air. This created a massive wave of resentment that Schultz either did not notice or he just did not care about. But Bumpy noticed. He saw the fire in the eyes of his neighbors, and he knew that he could turn that anger into a weapon that Schultz could never fight. Another fatal error the Dutchman made was conducting his takeover through very visible public violence that attracted way too much attention. When Schultz killed a black policy operator, he did not just remove a competitor, he created a martyr for the community to rally around. The families and associates of these victims became permanent enemies who were more than willing to cooperate with anyone who was opposing Schultz. Bumpy watched as Schultz's runners beat up anyone who refused to cooperate, and he heard the stories spreading through the barbershops and the churches about the Dutchman's cruelty. Public opinion was turning against Schultz even as his operations expanded across the neighborhood. Bumpy realized that Schultz was building a house of cards on a foundation of hatred, and it would only take one perfectly timed strike to bring it all down forever. The Dutchman also believed that he could buy every single person in Harlem because he thought everyone had a price. He was spending thousands of dollars on bribes for the police and local politicians to make sure they looked the other way while he crushed his rivals. But he did not realize that loyalty is something you cannot buy with stolen money. Bumpy was building a network of people who were loyal to him because he was one of them. While Schultz was staying in expensive hotels and surrounded by bodyguards, Bumpy was walking the streets of Harlem and listening to the people. He was becoming a ghost in his own neighborhood. He knew every alleyway and every rooftop and every secret door. He was preparing for a kind of warfare that Schultz was not equipped to handle. Bumpy was not fighting for money, he was fighting for the soul and the dignity of his entire community. Schultz considered the black gangsters to be inferior operators who only existed with white permission, and this level of racism was his greatest weakness. He did not believe that someone like Bumpy Johnson could ever outthink him or outmaneuver his organization. He saw Bumpy as a street thug who was in the way of his profits. This contempt made Schultz complacent and careless in a way that Bumpy was ready to exploit to the fullest extent. By 1934, the violence had reached a fever pitch, and the streets were stained with the blood of those who refused to bow to the Dutchman. Schultz felt like he was winning because his banks were full of money, but Bumpy saw that the Dutchman's enforcers were becoming increasingly isolated. They were afraid to walk the streets alone at night because they knew that Harlem was watching them and waiting for a chance to strike back in silence. Bumpy began to implement a strategy of systematic sabotage that was designed to hurt Schultz's bottom line without triggering a massive counterattack too early. He would disrupt the liquor deliveries and confuse the betting slips in ways that created chaos within Schultz's own organization. He wanted to make the Harlem operation more expensive and more trouble than it was worth for the Dutchman. He was playing a long and very dangerous game of chess. He was also recruiting a special team of men who were as cold and as disciplined as he was. These were men who had lost family members to Schultz's violence and who were looking for a chance to get even. Bumpy spent months training them and making sure they understood that they were not just shooters, but they were part of a larger plan to reclaim their home. He was building an army of ghosts who could strike and vanish without leaving a trace. The tension in Harlem was so thick you could practically feel it vibrating in the air every single day. People knew that a major explosion was coming, and they knew that Bumpy Johnson was the only one who could lead the resistance. Schultz was becoming more erratic, and his rage was boiling over because he could not understand why Harlem was not surrendering to him. He felt like the neighborhood was mocking him, and he was right because Bumpy was. Schultz would hold meetings with his top lieutenants and scream about why Bumpy was still alive and why the policy banks were still resisting. He would order more hits and more beatings, but it only made the community more defiant. He was losing control of his own narrative, and he did not even realize it. Bumpy was letting Schultz destroy his own reputation, while Bumpy stayed in the shadows and waited for the Dutchman to make the final fatal mistake. The Dutchman's collectors were starting to disappear, and his money was coming up short, but he was too blinded by his own ego to see the pattern. He thought it was just local incompetence or small-time theft, but it was actually the beginning of Bumpy's systematic elimination of his infrastructure. Bumpy was cutting the legs out from under the giant, and he was doing it so quietly that Schultz did not even realize he was about to fall down hard. Bumpy was also maintaining his relationship with Madame St. Clair even after she was forced into the shadows. He would visit her and discuss the progress of his campaign, and she would give him the wisdom and the connections she had built over decades. They were a perfect team of experience and execution. Bumpy was the sword that Madame St. Clair used to strike back at the man who had tried to take everything she had worked so hard to build. As the year 1934 came to a close, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just an enforcer. He was a symbol of hope for a neighborhood that was tired of being stepped on by the mob. He had successfully weathered the first wave of the Dutchman's invasion, and he was still standing. He had seen the errors in Schultz's strategy, and he had formulated a response that would be more brutal and more effective than anything the Dutchman could imagine. The real war was about to begin, and it would not be fought with loud guns in the streets, but with cold precision and a message that would last for 100 years. Bumpy was sitting in his apartment on West 139th Street, looking at the list of targets, and he knew that the time for observation was over. The ghost of the Dutchman had been haunting Harlem for too long, and it was time for Bumpy to finally lay that ghost to rest. Every slur that Schultz shouted and every drop of blood he spilled was being calculated by Bumpy. He was waiting for the perfect moment to provoke Schultz into a public display of disrespect that would give Bumpy the moral authority to launch his final campaign. He knew that the Cotton Club was the place where everything would come to a head, and he was ready for the confrontation that would define the rest of his life and the history of New York. As we end this part of our story, we see a man who has mastered the art of waiting. Bumpy Johnson has watched his enemy make every possible mistake, and he is now ready to strike. The Dutchman thinks he is the king of Harlem, but he is actually just a guest whose time has run out. The 7-day countdown is about to begin, and the streets of Harlem are about to turn red with the blood of those who forgot that respect is a matter of life and death. The air was freezing as the winter of 1934 set in, but the fire in Bumpy's heart was hotter than ever. He had his men, and he had his plan, and he had the silent support of every man and woman in Harlem. The ghost of the Dutchman was about to find out that you cannot haunt a place that belongs to someone else. Bumpy Johnson was ready to show the world that Harlem was his, and he was the only gatekeeper that mattered in the city. So guys, we are back in 1934, and honestly, the air in Harlem was just vibrating with this sense of impending doom, because the Queen, Madame Stephanie St. Clair, had made a choice that most people thought was suicide. She looked Dutch Schultz's enforcers in the eye and told them that she would never pay a single penny for the right to breathe in her own neighborhood. She was standing on her dignity even as the mob was closing in from every side. Bumpy Johnson was right there in the shadows, and he knew that this refusal was the spark that would ignite a fire that would burn for years to come. He saw that Madame Queen was being driven into a forced retirement by the Dutchman's brutal tactics, and Caspar Holstein had already been pushed out of the business entirely by the sheer force of Schultz's overwhelming resources and political connections. It felt like the end of an era for the local operators. But Bumpy was not a man who believed in surrender, and he began to implement a strategy of desperate resistance that was more like guerrilla warfare than a standard gang war. He knew he could not win a head-on fight with Schultz's army, so he decided to make Harlem a place where the Dutchman could not make a single dollar without losing two. He began to organize a series of small but very painful strikes against Schultz's massive and very vulnerable beer trucks. Imagine these giant trucks rumbling through the narrow streets of Harlem, thinking they were invincible because they had the protection of the police and the mob. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Bumpy's men would appear and smash the barrels or tip off the federal agents about the delivery routes. He was hitting Schultz where it hurt the most, which was his bank account and his pride. Bumpy was turning the Dutchman's own territory into a series of very expensive traps. Schultz was screaming in his Bronx headquarters because he could not understand how this was happening in a neighborhood he thought he had already conquered with his guns. He was pouring thousands of dollars into bribes for the police, but Bumpy was using his knowledge of the legal system to cause constant legal headaches for the mobsters' operations. Bumpy was playing a game of psychological chess that was slowly driving the Dutchman into a state of rage. Madame St. Clair was watching all of this, and she saw that Bumpy was doing something that no one else had dared to do, which was to treat Schultz like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. He was using the community as a massive and very silent shield. Whenever Schultz's men would come looking for the people responsible for the sabotage, the residents of Harlem would suddenly develop a collective case of amnesia and refuse to say a single word. Bumpy was also manipulating the betting slips in the policy banks that Schultz had taken over. He would have his men place large bets on numbers he knew were likely to hit, or he would create confusion in the accounting that made the banks lose thousands of dollars in a single afternoon. He was bleeding the Dutchman dry through 1,000 small cuts, and Schultz was too arrogant to see that he was being outmaneuvered by a man he considered to be an inferior. The violence on the streets was becoming almost unbearable as 1934 turned into 1935 and the bodies were starting to pile up in the gutters. Schultz was ordering more hits, but Bumpy's men were ghosts who moved through the rooftops and the basements with a familiarity that the Bronx thugs could never hope to match. Bumpy was turning Harlem into a labyrinth of danger where Schultz's men were afraid to walk alone at any time. Schultz's biggest mistake, guys, was that he was an outsider who brought white collectors into Harlem who treated the local residents with total and complete contempt. These men would walk into local shops and use racial slurs while demanding a cut of the profits, and it was creating a massive wave of resentment that Bumpy was harvesting like a crop. He was turning every insult from a white collector into a new recruit for his own private resistance army. Can you imagine the psychological pressure on a man like Dutch Schultz, who was used to having everyone bow to his will? He was being defied by a community that he thought he could crush with money and white privilege. He felt like the streets were mocking him, and he was right, because Bumpy Johnson was always there in the background, making sure the mockery was constant and very expensive. Bumpy was letting Schultz's own ego become the rope that would hang him. Bumpy was also spending his nights in the back rooms of jazz clubs, meeting with other local operators and convincing them to stop paying the Dutchman's protection fees. He told them that Harlem belonged to the people who lived there, and that if they stood together, they could drive the outsider away forever. He was building a coalition of resistance that was based on the idea of community trust and the shared experience of being disrespected by the Bronx mob. By the middle of 1935, the Dutchman's Harlem operations were in a state of total chaos, even though he was still technically in control of the territory. His profits were plummeting and his men were terrified of the ghost who was hunting them. Schultz was becoming increasingly erratic, and his public displays of rage were starting to alienate even his own lieutenants. They saw that Bumpy Johnson was not just a gangster, but a man who was fighting for a principle. Bumpy was waiting for the perfect moment to provoke Schultz into a public display of disrespect that would give him the moral authority to launch his final and most brutal campaign. He knew that if he could get Schultz to insult him in front of witnesses, it would turn the conflict into a matter of honor that the entire city would have to respect. He was baiting the trap, and the Dutchman was so blinded by his own rage that he was heading straight for the center. The air in Harlem was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the heavy feeling of a massive storm that was about to break. People were whispering Bumpy's name as the only man who was brave enough to stand up to the white monster from the Bronx. He was becoming a legend in his own time because he was proving that money and political connections were not enough to control a community that was united by a sense of shared dignity and a very long memory of pain. Bumpy was also refining his list of targets during these months, identifying the 8 men who were the most essential to Schultz's Harlem operations. He was watching their habits and their movements with the cold precision of a scientist. He knew exactly who had to die and in what order to make the entire structure collapse in just 7 days of absolute carnage. He was not just looking for revenge, he was looking for a total and permanent victory. Guys, you have to understand that Bumpy was not just a killer, he was a man who understood the geometry of power better than anyone else in the underworld. He saw that Schultz's empire was built on a very fragile foundation of fear, and if you could remove the men who instilled that fear, the entire thing would crumble into dust. He was preparing a message that would be written in blood and delivered with the certainty of a man who knew he was on the right side. As we end this part of the journey, we see Bumpy Johnson standing at the peak of his tactical observation. He has sabotaged the beer trucks and confused the betting slips and turned the community against the Dutchman. He has watched Schultz make every possible mistake, and he is now ready for the final confrontation. The shadow of the Dutchman is still there, but Bumpy is standing in the light of a new era for Harlem that he is about to create with his own hands. The Cotton Club was waiting, and the date was set for a meeting that would change the criminal landscape of New York for the next century. Bumpy was sitting in his apartment looking at the notebook of poetry he had written in prison, and he knew that the words were about to become deeds. The Dutchman thought he was the master of the city, but he was actually just a man who was about to be taught the true meaning of respect by the gatekeeper of Harlem himself. The psychological war was almost over, and the physical war was about to begin with a level of intensity that would shock the entire world. Bumpy had his men, and he had his weapons, and he had the silent prayers of every person in the neighborhood. He was ready to walk into the Cotton Club and look the devil in the eye and tell him that his time was up. The 7-day countdown was finally here, and there was no turning back for anyone involved in this. Every slur and every threat that Schultz had ever uttered was being weighed in the balance of Bumpy's mind. He was not going to strike in anger, but in a cold and calculated pursuit of justice for his people. He was ready to show the world that choices have consequences, and the consequence of disrespecting Bumpy Johnson was a death that would be as public and as terrifying as the insult itself. The stage was finally set for the most legendary week in history. Harlem, New York, the Cotton Club was absolutely packed on that Monday night, which was September 16, 1935, with over 200 patrons filling every single table in the room. The stage show was in full swing, and the illegal whiskey was flowing freely as the wealthy white downtown crowd mixed with the gangsters and the politicians and the celebrities in a scene that was simultaneously glamorous and dangerous. The music was loud and the conversation was even louder, but nobody was paying any particular attention to the table near the back where Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat completely alone, nursing a bourbon and watching the show with that quiet intensity that characterized everything he did. Nobody noticed until Dutch Schultz stood up from his reserved table near the stage with his face flushed red from expensive whiskey and rage. Schultz began walking. No, he was stomping across the club toward where Bumpy Johnson sat, with his bodyguards scrambling to follow him as other patrons turned to watch because his body language made it clear something dramatic was about to happen. Schultz reached the table, and he did not lean down to have a quiet conversation, nor did he lower his voice to maintain the pretense of civilized discourse between equals. Instead, Schultz slammed his hand down on Bumpy Johnson's table so hard that the bourbon glass jumped and spilled everywhere, and he shouted loud enough that people across the club stopped their conversations to listen. He shouted loud enough that the band faltered and the music died, and loud enough that every single person in the Cotton Club heard every word of the public humiliation that was about to unfold. "You have got some nerve showing your face in here tonight, boy," Schultz screamed while leaning over the table as if he wanted to crush Bumpy with his own weight. "You think you are somebody, and you think running a few penny anti-policy banks in Negro Town makes you a real gangster, but I have been trying to be reasonable with you people while trying to give you coloreds a chance to work for me and make something of yourselves." The entire club went silent as 200 people stopped talking and stopped moving and stopped breathing because Dutch Schultz was the most powerful bootlegger in New York, whose organization generated $20 million annually. This was the gangster who had never backed down from anyone, and he was publicly berating Bumpy Johnson using language so racist and so contemptuous that even in 1935 people were shocked. People were shocked by the naked hatred in the voice of Schultz because even in a whites-only nightclub in the middle of Harlem, this was an unprecedented level of disrespect toward a man who was supposed to be one of the toughest operators. Bumpy Johnson did not stand up, and he did not reach for the .45 automatic he carried, nor did he make any threatening gesture at all as he sat there staring at the man screaming at him. Bumpy just looked up at Schultz with eyes that showed no emotion whatsoever, as he displayed no anger and no fear and no reaction to the slur or the insult while he waited for Schultz to finish his tirade. The silence in the Cotton Club was absolute, and patrons at nearby tables were staring, horrified and fascinated at this public humiliation of a man who was taking this abuse without fighting back or defending himself. Witnesses watched as Bumpy sat there taking the racial slurs in front of hundreds of people while doing nothing except staring up at the white man who was screaming at him. And then Bumpy Johnson spoke, and his voice was so quiet that people had to strain to hear it, and so calm that it seemed completely disconnected from the fury Schultz was displaying at that moment. It was the most frightening thing they heard. Several witnesses later described Bumpy's voice as so cold it contained absolutely no heat and no emotion, just a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of a judge pronouncing a sentence. "You have got 7 days to get every one of your people out of Harlem," Bumpy said quietly as the words hung in the still air. "After that, any white man I find running policy in my neighborhood dies, and that is the end of it. You want to insult me in public, and you want to call me names in front of all these people, and that is fine, because that is your choice," Bumpy continued while looking Schultz in the eye. "But choices have consequences, Mr. Schultz, and the consequence of disrespecting Bumpy Johnson is that your people start dying, and I do not mean they get arrested or beaten. I mean they get dead, and you have 7 days, so use them wisely." Schultz threw back his head and laughed, a huge, genuine laugh that filled the silent club as the laugh of a man who could not believe what he was hearing and found it ridiculous. 7 days, Schultz roared, still laughing as he turned to address the entire club like an actor on a stage. "This Negro is giving me 7 days, and you all hear that because the boy thinks he can give Dutch Schultz ultimatums in his own city." Schultz turned back to Bumpy and said that in 7 days you will be working for me or you will be dead, because those are your only options. There is no third choice where you somehow win, because Negroes do not win against white men, and that is just how the world works. And if you are too stupid to understand that, well, I will teach you the hard way. Johnson did not respond to the threat or the laughter. Bumpy simply picked up what remained of his bourbon and drained the glass before standing up slowly and walking toward the exit of the club. The crowd parted for him like he was contagious, like being near him was dangerous now that Dutch Schultz had publicly marked him for destruction. Bumpy walked past Schultz without looking at him and walked past the bodyguards who tensed but did not stop him from leaving. Johnson walked out of the Cotton Club into the Harlem September night and disappeared into the darkness while Schultz watched him go, still chuckling and shaking his head. Schultz returned to his table and ordered another drink, and spent the rest of the evening recounting the story to anyone who would listen, describing how he had put that uppity colored boy in his place and how Harlem would be under his control. Dutch Schultz went to bed that night on Monday, September 16, 1935, believing he had won and believing he had publicly humiliated his last serious opponent in Harlem. He believed the conflict was essentially over, but exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes later, the first body was discovered. To understand what happened next, you must understand what was in Bumpy's mind as he walked. Bumpy Johnson was not surprised by the behavior because he had known for months that Schultz viewed him with contempt as an inferior operator who existed only with white permission. Schultz believed taking over Harlem would be as simple as showing up with enough guns and money to overwhelm resistance. But Bumpy had been watching Schultz make strategic errors for 18 months during his campaign in the streets. Schultz did not comprehend that the policy operations functioned because of community trust, and he brought outsiders into Harlem who treated the local people with contempt. But the biggest mistake and the fatal error that would cost Schultz 8 men was the public humiliation at the Cotton Club, because he made the conflict personal rather than business by turning it into a referendum on respect and race. Schultz had given Bumpy Johnson something invaluable, which was moral authority, as Bumpy walked toward his apartment on West 139th Street. His mind was formulating a response that would be so decisive and so brutal and so effective that it would establish principles about power that would govern the New York criminal underworld for the next 100 years, as the message was written in blood. The response Bumpy conceived that night had 3 essential elements, which were complete operational silence, a systematic elimination of key operators, and a message that would outlast the conflict. Bumpy would disappear immediately to make Schultz complacent and careless while he identified the 8 men who actually made Schultz's Harlem operation function through collection and enforcement and management. Bumpy knew that killing Schultz directly would trigger massive retaliation from white gangsters, so he chose to kill the collectors and the enforcers brutally and publicly. He wanted to send a message that disrespecting black criminals and using racist language carried severe consequences. Future white gangsters would think very carefully before calling a black gangster a slur in a public place. Bumpy reached his apartment at approximately 1:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, and he did not sleep but spent the next 4 hours meeting with his most trusted associates. These were men who had worked with him for years and who would follow orders without asking questions and keep secrets even under torture. Bumpy gave these men a list of 8 names of the people whose deaths would cripple the Dutchman. His instructions were precise that these 8 men die in the next 7 days, 1 per day in the order of the list, and that each death must be discovered quickly. Every body must have a note counting down how many were left, starting with the collector Vincent Mell tomorrow night. Bumpy told his men to torture him somewhere private so he understands why he is dying before pinning a note that says 1 down. One of his men asked how they would survive the retaliation, since Schultz would burn Harlem down to find them, but Bumpy smiled a cold smile and said, "Schultz cannot kill what he cannot find." Bumpy planned to disappear while operating through intermediaries, and he knew that the Harlem community would protect them because everybody saw what Schultz did at the Cotton Club, and they would not help the white man who insulted them. Bumpy said that killing Schultz's people was no longer just business, but it was payback for every insult and every slur, and every time white gangsters treated them like they were nothing. By 5:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, the team had finalized the plan and assigned specific targets to killers while arranging surveillance to track their movements. Safe houses for the torture were identified and weapons were gathered. At 6 a.m., Bumpy Johnson walked out of his apartment carrying a small suitcase and climbed into a car and vanished from public view for the next 7 days. Dutch Schultz would spend the entire week searching for Bumpy and offering money for information, but Bumpy had become a ghost who was present only in the systematic executions of the men on the list. The countdown had begun, and the first body was waiting. Vincent Mell was a tough and reliable collector who had been doing the work for 18 months, and he was the first to pay the price for the Dutchman's ego at the Cotton Club. Mell never made his delivery on Monday night because while Schultz was bragging about the humiliation, 3 of Bumpy's men intercepted Mell's car on a quiet side street and dragged him to an abandoned warehouse where the thick walls hid the screams. The torture of Vincent Mell was designed to send a message about what happens to people who work for Dutch Schultz in Harlem after he disrespected Bumpy Johnson. They used a hammer to systematically break every finger while Mell begged and tried to explain he had nothing personal against Bumpy. But the men were not interested in apologies because this pain was the direct consequence of working for a man who used those slurs. They beat his face with fists and clubs and knocked out his teeth, making sure it would be obvious he suffered extensively before he was allowed to die. They asked him if he knew why this was happening, and if he knew what his boss did tonight by disrespecting their people. Mel offered money and cooperation, but the men were only interested in killing him in a way that would terrify the other 7 people on the list. They used an ice pick to stab Mel 11 times in non-lethal areas to cause tremendous pain without killing him immediately, and they took their time over an hour. Finally, when he was barely conscious, they cut his throat so deeply the blade scraped against his vertebrae and stuffed his body into a garbage drum. They pinned the note written in block letters that said, "1 down 7 to go leave Harlem." At 6:23 a.m., a sanitation worker found the drum, and the police immediately understood they were looking at the beginning of a gang war rather than an isolated murder. The message was clear that 7 more people were going to die one by one until Dutch Schultz left Harlem as ordered. Word spread throughout the underworld, and the Dutchman heard the news while eating his breakfast in the Bronx. Schultz realized that the 7-day deadline was not empty posturing, but was a literal promise that his operators would start dying every single day. His rage was predictable, but Bumpy had disappeared, and Harlem refused to cooperate with the white gangster who had called them names. The countdown continued into Wednesday as an envelope was slipped under the door of Schultz's headquarters to remind him of the cost. So, guys, we have to talk about that Tuesday morning on September 17th, 1935, because the air in New York City was about to change forever, and it started with a single metal garbage drum. At 6:23 a.m., a sanitation worker named James Robertson was just doing his normal rounds on West 145th Street when he noticed a drum that was unusually heavy, and he opened it, thinking it was just extra trash. Instead of trash, he found the mangled corpse of Vincent Mel, who was one of the most effective policy collectors for Dutch Schultz, and honestly, the description of what they found is just so heartbreakingly brutal. Mel had been tortured for hours, with every single finger on his hands, systematically crushed by a hammer, before his throat was sliced so deeply that his head was nearly severed from his body as a message. Pinned to his shirt was a simple note written in block letters that said, "1 down 7 to go leave Harlem." And guys, you have to imagine the absolute shock of the police officers when they realized this was not just a murder, but a countdown. The message was clear, and it was terrifying because it meant that Bumpy Johnson had actually meant every single word he said during that confrontation at the Cotton Club. Word of the murder spread through the underworld like wildfire, and by 9 a.m., every gangster in New York knew that Vincent Mel was dead and that Bumpy Johnson was officially on the warpath. Dutch Schultz heard the news while he was eating breakfast at his headquarters in the Bronx, and at first he tried to dismiss it as a random act of violence that was unrelated to his public disrespect of the Harlem leader. But then his men told him about the note and the specific countdown, and Schultz realized that the 7-day deadline he had laughed at was a literal promise of death for his entire Harlem operation. His reaction was predictable, and he exploded into a fit of rage, ordering his men to find Bumpy Johnson immediately and kill everyone associated with him regardless of the cost to his organization or the heat it brought. The problem for Schultz was that Bumpy had completely vanished into the shadows, and his apartment was empty, and his policy banks were closed for business. It was as if he had become a ghost who only manifested through the systematic execution of the men on his list. Schultz spent the entire day offering huge sums of money for any information about Bumpy's location, but the community of Harlem stayed silent. The people of Harlem were still furious about the way Schultz had insulted them at the Cotton Club, and they were not about to help the white gangster find the man who was fighting for them. They protected Bumpy with a wall of silence that Schultz could not break, no matter how much money he offered or how many people he threatened. The Dutchman was realizing that his power did not extend into the heart of the community. Wednesday morning on September 18th arrived with a new level of tension because everyone was waiting to see if Bumpy would follow through with the second execution on his list. Schultz found an envelope slipped under the door of his Bronx headquarters, and inside was a note in the same block letters telling him that the next one would die today and he should pull out of Harlem before it was too late. The note said, "One down, 7 to go. Your collector is dead because you disrespected us, and the next one dies today, so you should pull out of Harlem or keep counting bodies." It was a cold and clinical reminder that Bumpy was watching every move they made, and that no amount of security could stop what was coming next. Schultz was no longer laughing, and he was starting to feel a very real sense of dread. At 2:15 p.m. on Wednesday, the body of Raymond Red Sullivan was discovered in an abandoned building on Lenox Avenue, and this hit even harder than the first murder. Sullivan was not just a collector, he was a key operator who was supposed to be protected by 2 armed bodyguards after the news of Mel's death. But all 3 men were found shot dead in what looked like a brief but very decisive gunfight. Pinned to Sullivan's chest was the second note, which said 2 down, 6 to go, and the psychological impact on Schultz's remaining men was absolutely devastating. They realized that even with guards, they were not safe from Bumpy's assassins, who seemed to move through Harlem with total impunity. The enforcers, who were used to being the ones doing the hurting, were now the ones looking over their shoulders in fear. Schultz was now genuinely frightened because 3 of his people were gone in just 2 days, and the countdown was relentless. He called an emergency meeting and told his lieutenants to burn Harlem down if they had to, but they could not find a single person to betray Bumpy. The neighborhood was unified in its resistance, and the Dutchman was starting to understand that he had made a fatal error in judgment. Thursday morning brought another envelope to the Bronx headquarters with a note that said, 2 down, 6 to go. Every day you stay in Harlem, another one of your people dies. It asked him how many bodies it would take before he understood that he needed to leave now. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and the silence from Bumpy was even more terrifying than the violence because it showed total control. At 9:40 p.m. on Wednesday, which was technically the start of Thursday, the third body was found, and it was Thomas Little, Tommy Brennan. He was found in his own apartment, stabbed 17 times, with an ice pick in the same methodical and slow torture style that had characterized the death of Vincent Mell. The note pinned to his body said 3 down, 5 to go, and gave him one last chance to leave Harlem. Brennan's death proved that not even their homes were safe, and that Bumpy's men could get to them anywhere at any time. Schultz was now barricaded in his headquarters, surrounded by his best bodyguards, but he felt more vulnerable than ever before in his criminal career. He was losing his Harlem operations piece by piece, and his remaining men were starting to talk about quitting or running away to save themselves. The precision of the killings was what really terrified the underworld because it suggested a level of planning and capability that Schultz had completely underestimated. Bumpy was not just killing people, he was conducting a surgical strike against the infrastructure of the Dutchman's empire. He was taking out the people who actually made the money flow, and without them, the entire operation was starting to fail. Schultz sent out more men to ask questions and threaten people in Harlem, but the response was always the same: absolute silence and cold stares from the residents. They knew that every day Schultz stayed meant another one of his men would die, and they were more than happy to wait and watch the Dutchman crumble. Bumpy had successfully turned the entire community into his silent partner in this war for respect. By Thursday afternoon, the Dutchman was no longer the confident bully who had slammed his hand down on the table at the Cotton Club. He was a man who was watching his power slip away, and he was realizing that racial superiority was a useless weapon against a man like Bumpy Johnson. The countdown was at 5, and the air in the Bronx was thick with the scent of defeat, even though Schultz refused to admit it yet. Bumpy remained invisible throughout all of this, and he was like a ghost who was directing a symphony of death from an unknown location. He was proving that respect was not something you could take by force, but something you had to earn or face the consequences of losing it. The next 3 days would be even more brutal as the countdown reached the halfway point and the message became even more personal and direct. The psychological war was working perfectly, and Bumpy's men were executing their orders with a clinical efficiency that left no room for error. They were following the list exactly as Bumpy had written it, and they were making sure that each death was a spectacle of pain and fear for the rest of Schultz's organization to witness. The war for Harlem was no longer a dispute over money, it was a referendum on honor. Schultz was now offering a fortune for Bumpy's head, but there were no takers because everyone knew that taking Schultz's money was a death sentence in Harlem. The loyalty of the community was Bumpy's greatest asset, and it was something that the Dutchman's $20 million could never buy or break. The third day was ending, and the fourth was about to bring even more carnage to the streets of New York. As we end this part of the countdown, we see a man who was once the king of the city, now reduced to hiding in his own headquarters while a ghost hunts his men. Dutch Schultz had 7 days to leave Harlem, but he chose to stay, and now 3 of his people are dead, and 5 more are waiting for their turn on the list. The bloody war is only getting started, and the next victims are already being watched by the shadows. Friday, September 20th, 1935, started with a heavy fog that seemed to wrap itself around the brownstones of Harlem like a funeral shroud. And honestly, guys, you could feel the absolute terror in the air. Everyone in the city was waiting for the next body to drop because the count was at 3 and the weekend was coming fast. The Dutchman's men were no longer just afraid, they were losing their minds with paranoia as the clock kept ticking. The 4th man on the list was Anthony Little, Tony Benedetto, and his end was as lonely as it was brutal in a dark alleyway. Tony was one of those guys who thought he was untouchable because he had a big gun and a bigger mouth, but the streets of Harlem had a way of swallowing men like him whole. He was found beaten to death with a level of ferocity that suggested his killers wanted him to feel every single second of his boss's mistakes. Pinned to his blood-soaked shirt was the note that the entire city had been whispering about, which simply read, 5 down, 3 to go, leave Harlem. But Bumpy was not done for the day because Friday was about to become a double feature of horror for the Schultz organization. While the police were still processing the scene in the alleyway, another call came in from a crowded restaurant on the other side of the neighborhood that shocked everyone. Joseph Joey Numbers Catalano was sitting at a table surrounded by people who thought they were safe because there were witnesses everywhere. But guys, you have to imagine the scene as 2 men walked in calmly and ignored everyone else in the room as they headed straight for Joey. They did not shout or cause a scene, they just stood over him and shot him directly in the face, while dozens of people watched in absolute and total silence. It was so bold and so clinical that the witnesses said they could not even move as the 2 assassins simply walked back out the door and vanished. The note pinned to Joey's chest was the 6th one, which said 6 down, 2 to go, leave now or die. This was a message that Bumpy could reach them anywhere, even in broad daylight, in front of 50 people who would never dare to testify against the ghost of Harlem. That evening, another envelope arrived at Schultz's headquarters in the Bronx, and this one was different because it contained a much longer message. It explained that these men were dying because Schultz had forgotten that respect flows both ways, and that white privilege did not give him license to treat black brothers like they were nothing. It said that Schultz thought they would just submit like good coloreds, but he was wrong. Schultz was now in a state of near total psychological collapse, and he spent Saturday barricaded in his headquarters, surrounded by every guard he had. He was no longer the confident king of the underworld. He was a man who was terrified of a letter and a countdown. He sent messages to his top lieutenant, Harold Bunny Weinstein, telling him to stay out of sight, but Bunny was already being watched by Bumpy's invisible army. Saturday morning, September 21st, brought the 7th execution, and it happened in the busiest part of the city, which was Midtown Manhattan. Harold Bunny Weinstein was found shot in the back of the head inside his own car on West 47th Street in broad daylight. Bumpy was showing Schultz that he could strike outside of Harlem and that nowhere in New York City was safe for anyone who wore the Dutchman's colors. The note said, 7 down, 1 to go, your weekend is tomorrow. And honestly, guys, the level of psychological warfare here is just so incredible. Bumpy was telling his enemy exactly when the next strike was coming, and there was absolutely nothing Schultz could do to stop it. He was being dismantled piece by piece, and his entire organization was watching him fail to protect the very men who made him his $20 million. Sunday, September 22nd, was the final day of the ultimatum, and the tension in the city was like a rubber band that was about to snap. The last man on the list was Patrick O'Brien, and he had spent the entire weekend hiding in a safe house in the Bronx, protected by 4 armed guards. They thought that since they were outside Harlem and behind locked doors, they might actually survive the final hour of the countdown. But at 8:47 p.m., a woman knocked on the door, claiming she had the wrong apartment, and when a guard opened it, she threw a gasoline bomb inside. The apartment erupted in flames instantly, and the guards ran for the back exit, only to be cut down by shotgun fire from men waiting in the alleyway. O'Brien tried to escape through a window, but he was shot before he could even climb through the frame. When the fire was finally extinguished, the firefighters found O'Brien's badly burned corpse and a note that was partially scorched, but still legible. It read, 8 down, 0 to go. Harlem belongs to Harlem, and told them never to disrespect black brothers again. The 7-day war was over, and Bumpy Johnson had fulfilled every single word of his promise with a level of violence that New York would never forget. Schultz was left sitting in his headquarters with 8 dead men and an operation in Harlem that had completely vanished in just 1 week. He had laughed at Bumpy on Monday night, but by Sunday night he was a man who had been thoroughly and publicly defeated by the very person he called a nobody. The message, written in blood, was finally complete, and the era of the Dutchman's control over Harlem had come to a violent end. The psychological impact of these 8 bodies in 7 days was so profound that it established a new rule for the entire criminal underworld. It was a lesson that respect was not optional, and that racial superiority was no protection against a man who was willing to strike from the shadows. Bumpy Johnson had established himself as the master of New York, and his legend was just beginning as the smoke cleared in the Bronx. As we end this 9th part of our story, we see a city that is in total shock and a gangster who has successfully rewritten the rules of power. Bumpy Johnson had shown that he could take on the most powerful mobster in the world and win through sheer intellect and cold-blooded execution. The 8th body was the final period on a sentence that Schultz had started at the Cotton Club, and the final word was definitely Bumpy's to speak. The aftermath was about to begin, and the lessons of those 7 days would last for 100 years in the streets of Harlem. Bumpy was ready to step back into the light and reclaim his kingdom, while Schultz was left to wonder how a man he disrespected had managed to destroy his world so quickly. The war was won, but the descent of Bumpy Johnson was only just starting to be written in the history of the great city of New York. Monday morning, September 23, 1935, arrived with a silence that felt heavier than the fog of the previous night. And honestly, guys, it was the kind of quiet that follows a massive explosion where your ears are still ringing and you are just waiting for the world to start moving again. The entire city was staring at the headlines about the burned safe house in the Bronx and the 8 dead men who were scattered across the 5 boroughs like broken toys. Dutch Schultz sat in his dark office in the Bronx with his hands trembling as he stared at the final envelope that had been slipped under his door at dawn. He was no longer the arrogant monster who had slammed his hand down at the Cotton Club only 7 days ago. He was a man who had watched his empire bleed out 1 body at a time, and he knew that the ghost of Harlem was now standing right behind him with a cold knife and a very long memory. The letter inside was written in the same clean block letters, and it was the longest one yet as it spelled out the final terms of his total surrender. It said, 8 of your men are dead, and they died because you made a choice to disrespect me in public and to call me names in front of hundreds of people. It told him that he thought Bumpy was bluffing, and he thought colored gangsters were inferior to white criminals, but the 8 bodies proved he was wrong. The letter gave Schultz a final and terrifying ultimatum, which was that he had exactly 24 hours to close every single operation he had in Harlem. Bumpy warned him that if he did not leave, then the killing would start everywhere, not just in Harlem, but in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Manhattan. It would be one person per day until Schultz was completely out of the neighborhood because this was no longer about money or territory. Bumpy wrote that this was about respect and teaching every white gangster in New York that they could not disrespect black brothers without paying a price. The price so far was 8 bodies, and it would be many more if the Dutchman did not get out and stay out. The letter ended with a reminder that colored gangsters deserve the same respect that any white man demands for himself, and it was signed with the name that now carried the weight of death. By Tuesday evening, September 24th, every single one of Dutch Schultz's Harlem operations had been shut down, and his men had retreated in total fear. He abandoned 18 months of work and a massive investment of thousands of dollars because he realized that Bumpy Johnson demonstrated the capability and the will to keep killing indefinitely. The Dutchman had been driven out of Harlem by a man he called a nobody only 1 week earlier. The story spread through every speakeasy and mob social club in New York, and people were retelling the events of the 7-Day War with a sense of awe and terror. Dutch Schultz had publicly humiliated Bumpy Johnson at the Cotton Club, and within 7 days his men were dead, and he was a broken man. The lesson was so profound that it lasted not just for years, but for generations of criminals who would never forget what happened in Harlem. White gangsters who dealt with black operators after 1935 were suddenly very careful about their language and their displays of contempt. They realized that racial superiority was no protection against a man who was willing to strike from the shadows with clinical precision. Everyone remembered what happened to the Dutchman when he forgot that respect flows both ways, and when he assumed his skin color meant he could say anything to anyone. On Tuesday, September 24th, Bumpy Johnson finally emerged from hiding, and he walked casually down Lenox Avenue as if he had never been gone at all. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and he tipped his hat to the neighbors who watched him with a mixture of reverence and fear. He had walked into the darkness as a targeted man, and he walked back into the light as the undisputed king of northern Manhattan and the protector of Harlem. Reporters rushed to him and asked about the 8 murders that had paralyzed the city, but Bumpy just looked at them with those empty eyes and said he didn't know what they were talking about. He told them that Harlem protects its own, and that anybody who comes here disrespecting the people or calling them names would learn that choices have consequences. He said Schultz made his choice at the Cotton Club, and he paid for it with 8 people. Bumpy looked directly into the cameras and said, "If you disrespect black brothers, you pay the price, and if you remember that you will live a lot longer in this world." It was a statement of fact that felt like a new law being written into the concrete of the city. He had not just won a war, he had established a principle that would govern criminal interactions for the next century, and he had done it with the blood of those who dared to ignore him. Dutch Schultz never returned to Harlem, and exactly 1 month later, on October 23, 1935, he was killed in Newark by hitmen from other white gangs. They decided he was too reckless and too dangerous, and his war with Bumpy had brought too much heat on everyone else. He died in a hospital bed, babbling in a feverish state, while Bumpy Johnson was sitting comfortably in Harlem, overseeing a new and powerful empire. Bumpy took over everything Schultz had left behind, and he built a criminal organization that was more structured and more disciplined than anything Harlem had ever seen. He became a legend not just because of the violence, but because he proved that a man from Charleston could outthink and outfight the most powerful mobs in America. He became the gatekeeper who decided who could do business in his neighborhood and under what terms they could operate. The message of those 8 bodies in 7 days was a message written in blood that New York's underworld never forgot for the next 100 years. Don't ever disrespect black brothers, not in public and not in private, if you want to keep breathing in this city. Bumpy Johnson had turned a racial slur into a crown, and he had turned a public humiliation into a throne that he would occupy for the rest of his long and very legendary life. As we end this final part of our journey, we see a man who successfully navigated the most dangerous week in the history of crime. Bumpy Johnson survived the Jim Crow South and the prison dungeons and the Dutch Schultz invasion to become the most respected man in New York. His story is a chilling reminder that in the world of power, respect is the only currency that truly matters, and the price of losing it is often a debt that can only be paid in blood. The Cotton Club remained as a symbol of that night, and the people of Harlem never stopped whispering about the man who sat alone with a bourbon and waited for the world to burn. Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a name, he was a principle and a warning and a king. He had walked through the fire and he had come out as the master of the shadows and the gatekeeper of a kingdom that he had built with his own 2 hands and 8 cold bodies. Thank you guys for listening to this incredible and terrifying story of survival and respect. Bumpy Johnson's life would continue to be a whirlwind of controversy and power, but that one week in 1935 will always be the moment he became immortal. If you want to hear more about the psychological battles of history's greatest gangsters, don't forget to stay tuned for the next episode where we dive even deeper into the darkness of the city. Harlem belonged to Harlem because Bumpy Johnson made it so, and the rules he established on that bloody Monday night were still being followed long after he was gone. He proved that intelligence and discipline can overcome any amount of money or privilege, and that a man who respects himself is a man that the entire world will eventually have to respect too. The crown of blood was his, and he wore it with a quiet intensity that never faded until the very end.